Hi everyone, welcome to another Hatton's Model Railways live stream. And this morning I want to answer one of the questions I get asked the most. It's a fairly beginner question, but it's a really good question too. It is, what are the different types of tank engines? What do the different names mean? Where would you find these different engines on the railways of the UK? Why were they built differently? Why is a saddle tank and not a side tank, for instance? Why are there all the different types? Now, as I'm sure you can imagine, they were built for quite specific uses running across the network. So I thought this morning I'd go into some of the definitions and the explanations of these type of locomotives, why they were built, what purposes they mainly served, and where you can put one onto your layout. So if you do have any questions at all, feel free to ask them in the chat or put a comment under the video if you're watching a little later. And don't hesitate to get in touch with our customer experience team, who would be more than happy to give you a hand too. We have hundreds of different tank engines available in model form now, and I've put a link to our hattons.co.uk website below where you can find many of those engines available. So let's head over to some of the types we've got here today. I've got some of the 00 gauge models here in front of me of various different tank engines in various different sizes. We'll be going from some of the smallest right through to some of the largest ever to be used on the UK's network too. Most of the first locomotives built were neither tank nor tender locomotives. They were locomotives which carried around a small wagon behind them, mainly carrying a barrel of water for the low distances that they were expected to travel. Some of the first locomotives in the 1830s, such as Stephenson's rocket, were built again with a small, very primitive tender design behind the locomotive, again carrying water and coal for the journey. But heading into the 1840s and 1850s, the tank locomotive became very popular in the UK, the smaller design allowing it to get into yards and places where the bigger designs couldn't go. And for locomotives that didn't quite need as much fuel capacity or did not need to run as much distance at the same speeds, they became a really popular design. Of course, over the course of the next century, we did get some really powerful and really fast tank locomotives too. But starting off, the main design you could find out there was either the saddle tank or the side tank design. So let's start with the saddle tank that I've got an example of on the screen here for you now. This is the Hornby Peckett B2. And you'll see here that the water tank for this locomotive covers the boiler area pretty much like a horse's saddle, hence the saddle tank name. So this sits atop the boiler. This was a really popular design from the mid-19th century onwards. It fell out of favour a bit towards the start of the 20th century for a number of reasons. Firstly, a lot of the boilers on the locomotives, as they became more powerful, were getting larger. So it became trickier to fit a whole set of tanks around the entire boiler, as we see here, the entire top of the boiler, should I say, sorry. But at the time, this was one of the most efficient ways to get as much water as possible onto these locomotives. You'll also see there that it's going to be quite hard to see in front of you with these tanks in place too. These saddle tanks, shall I say, did have the restrictions that the tanks did take up a lot of the viewing area for the driver and the crew of the locomotives. So this design did fall out of favour quite quickly. You'll mainly find that the saddle tank locomotives were some of these smaller designs from the late 19th century and the mid-19th century. We have here the Peckett B4. And from the 20th century, they mainly were used on industrial locomotives where they weren't traveling at high speeds, they were being used in yards. So having the extra weight of the saddle tank to help the adhesion there, and of course, the slow speeds that these locomotives were expected to run at, it didn't really matter that the view wasn't too great because you generally know where you're going and going at a slow enough speed to prevent any incidents there. Of course, there's a good amount of saddle tank locomotives in use on the mainline railways too, and although these fell out of favour quite quickly in the 20th century, some of the later designs did stay on with the Great Western Railway right through to the 1920s and 1930s there too. So they are still quite a popular design, but at the same time, this is something, if you're looking back in railway history, this is more towards the start. So another design of tank that was appearing around the same time was the well tank. Now, a well is a source of water that you dip into to get your water for, and this is exactly the same with the well tank locomotive. So you'll see here on this model of the BT well tank loco that you've got no tanks on the sides and no tanks on the top of the boiler. The tank is actually situated in the frames underneath the boiler there. So this, as you can imagine, isn't the largest amount of water that you could carry on a locomotive, but it does give great viewing on the top of the boiler. It gives great visibility for the driver and firemen, and it does allow great access to the frames and some of the equipment there too. So these types of tank were coming quite popular again in the 1860s and 1870s. These LSWR well tanks appeared in the late 1870s, and some of them ran right through to the 1960s. Now, these, as you can imagine, don't weigh as much as the saddle tank with its hefty tank on top of the boiler. So these were very good locomotives for lightly laid routes or places where the axle loading wasn't too high either. So if you had somewhere that had some quite delicate bridges and not the best track work, the well tanks could certainly head down there, and they did have their place on those lines. But as you can imagine, with the very small tanks that we can't even see on this model because they are between the frames there, they didn't have the highest amount of capacity running on the lines. So you didn't see too many well tanks out there, but the ones you did certainly had their niche, as we saw there with the BT well tank running on various branches in Cornwall right through to the 1960s. Next up, we have the side tank locomotives. Now, these were again designs that were coming through and through, and this was the popular style of tank to be built from the late 19th century right through to the 1950s, as we see with this standard 4 side tank locomotive that we see here. You can see the difference in the locomotives we've been looking at so far. This is by far a larger tank locomotive, but it does have the water tanks on the side of the boiler there, indicating it is a side tank rather than a saddle tank, as the tanks will go over the top. You can see here that the boiler's pretty much right up to the top of the cab here too, so you haven't really got much room for saddle tanks heading over the top of this boiler. And as boilers became larger and more powerful on the UK's railways, these side tank locomotives really took over in their respective designs. You'll see too that they do get larger and larger, and this is as they had to compete with a lot of the tender locomotives running out there, which too were becoming larger and more powerful in this period. A lot of locomotives, such as the standard 4 tank that you see here, and engines running right through from the late 19th century of the side tank design, were used on suburban passenger duties. They required no turning round. As you can see with the side tank design there, they have the great visibility heading down the top of the tank forwards, but also fantastic visibility to the rear. So there was no need to turn these locomotives on a turntable or any tricky tenders getting in the way too. So you had a really efficient locomotive design there, just as good at running backwards as it was running forwards too. So this is the design that became pretty much the most popular in the UK from around 1890, 1900 onwards, and survived right until the end of steam in the late 1960s. Quite a few of them were in place on industrial railways too. And again, these larger locomotive designs, as you see here, when it comes to tank engines, pretty much were the side tank design to incorporate the largest boilers and the tanks on the side of the locomotives. Some of the largest locomotives to work on the UK's railway system were tank engines. Everyone thinks that the 210 tender engines were some of the largest, and they were, but at the same time, we did have some pretty large tank engines too. This is a London North Western Railway designed 084 tank locomotive. This is a pretty huge locomotive based on the LNWR Class G2A 080 tender engines. Locomotives such as this with the large boilers and large tanks were mainly dedicated to banking duties, assisting heavy trains up steep inclines. But at the same time, they did find their purpose on some of the steeply graded routes on goods trains too. A little bit more further and harder between to see, but they are out there. You don't see too many of these larger tank engines. The Great Western and the Great Central had a few of these larger freight designs too. And speaking of the Great Western, one locomotive tank design that never really took off elsewhere, but certainly did on the Great Western, was the Pannier tank locomotive. This is in effect a development of the saddle tank, with the overslung tank stern not reaching to the bottom of the frames, allowing the access to the inside valve gear on this locomotive for maintenance, which is cut off on the side tank locomotives. However, as we can see, the tank doesn't go across the top of the boiler there, so it does still have the improved visibility for the driver and the fireman of the side tank. So this is a bit of a best of both design. And this really is something that the Great Western Railway found quite popular on their locomotives, building these Pannier tanks from the late 1870s right through to the 1950s in various different, slightly amended designs, but all basically being the Pannier tank type, with the higher tanks there that don't come in contact with the frames and also don't go over the top of the boiler. You will find a small number of these Pannier tank designs in preservation, and you'll find them in industrial use too from the 1930s onwards with quite a few different owners. But the main place for these in the UK was the Great Western Railway, who built thousands of these Pannier tank locomotives, being their preferred type of locomotive for light shunting duties, branch line traffic, and some smaller freight trains. And you did have the best of both worlds there, with the access to the frames and, of course, the access to the top of the boiler, not restricting visibility too. So if you are looking at a Pannier tank locomotive, you may have to look at a Great Western design, but they certainly are out there. We have covered some of the main tank designs. We've covered the main tank designs used in the UK, shall I say, but there are a couple of others that aren't so common, but are still worth a quick mention. One of these, especially in narrow gauge, I can't think of a standard gauge example, is the wing tank locomotive, as we see here. The tanks of the locomotive are actually situated right up against the smoke box of this locomotive, as you can see here. This is a 2'6" gauge, narrow gauge locomotive on the Welshpool and Llanfair Railway. And you can see here that the tanks themselves are right at the front of the loco. This gives good stability on this particular locomotive, balancing the weight out between the equipment at the rear of the locomotive and the water tanks at the front of the locomotive too. It's not a very common design, but at the same time, it was good again in some of those industrial narrow gauge uses out there too. What you'll also see is combinations where a locomotive has one or more types of the tanks. Looking at the Adams class 0415 locomotives, as you can see here, there's one of these preserved at the Bluebell Railway. I'm sure some of you have seen. And this particular design has a very small set of side tanks just in front of the cab there, but also a separate well tank too underneath the frame. So you will find that some locomotives combine several different tank types to increase their water capacity. And that's what this is all about. It is the ability to carry more and more water as is needed on these particular designs. The more water you can carry, the further distance you'll be able to go. But at the same time, that comes at a cost of your locomotive being quite heavier too, which in cases of the heavy freight tank engines, we see again the LNWR locomotive here. This was to its advantage, where it could really provide great adhesion and haul some of the heaviest goods trains on the network. But if you're wanting a locomotive that can go pretty much anywhere, including some of the light railways and the lightly laid lines, you do want a locomotive such as the BT Well tank, where the water capacity is quite minimal, but at the same time, that comes at the cost of giving you a really light locomotive that you can take anywhere on your network. So I hope I've explained some of the basics to you here today of what all those different terminologies mean. Next time you hear about a side tank locomotive being released or the latest model of a brand new saddle tank, you'll certainly know what to be looking for on your particular designs. And as said at the start of the stream, we have hundreds of different types and classes of different tank locomotives available right now. If you want to head over to the link in the description, If you're looking at the locomotives there's a handy guide on which type of locomotive is which type of tank. If you look at the wheel arrangement on the description, you'll see a different code at the end of the wheel arrangement. So if it's a saddle tank, this would be an ST at the end of the wheel arrangement. So in this case, this would be an 060 ST. If it's a well tank, it's a WT. So you've got a 240 WT here. If you're looking at a pannier tank, I'm sure you can guess this by now, it's a PT. So you've got an 060 PT. And if it's just a plain old tank engine or a side tank, it is just a T. No extra letter in there. So we have a 264T there. So if you're looking at those wheel arrangements now, you'll understand what those letters mean at the end. And we are producing a separate video on explaining wheel arrangements for steam and diesel locomotives too. So if you want to learn some more there, head over to our YouTube channel and check that one out too. So I hope you've enjoyed today's video. I hope you've learned a little bit more about how to decipher some of the codes and terminologies brought in to explain the different types of tank locomotives. If you have enjoyed it, don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel, and of course, like our Facebook page for all the latest model railway news, more of these beginner's guide videos, and of course, all the guides we have on there too for building up your model railway. If you have got any other questions, don't hesitate to put a comment in the chat underneath the video, or do get in touch with our customer experience team, who'd be more than happy to help you too. Otherwise, thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.